Treasury Secretary Martin Parkinson, in an address yesterday, says Australians have got to pay more tax or expect much less from government. Is he right?
Well, Tim, I'm not sure about more tax, but he was certainly speaking some common sense. I mean, we've got an ageing population. We don't have any population boom lying ahead of us, and the world economic environment is going to be sluggish for some time to come. And you know, when you think about it, since the Howard years, we've been giving the community everything at once. Tax cuts, both corporate and individual, and we've been spending more money on things like health and hospitals and schools and education, and indeed infrastructure, things like motorways. And at the same time, we put a carbon constraint on the economy because that's what the community was asking for, and it's what John Howard had intended to do, while at the same time compensating both business and individuals for the effects of that carbon constraint. Business subsidies, tax cuts, increases in pensions, and things like family allowances. So you don't have to be an economist to work out that we have a structural problem and some very big challenges ahead.
Do you acknowledge then that making the change to the carbon pricing and the compensation that went with it has actually added to our structural problem in the budget in this regard?
Well, I've heard Greg Combet himself say that the carbon price, of course, puts a cost on the economy. How big a cost will be determined in the long run by the price of that carbon constraint. But Tony Abbott's got the big problem here. He says he's going to keep the carbon constraint, or some people like to call it the carbon tax, but leave in place all of the compensation. Now, that just doesn't add up, and I think what Martin Parkinson is saying is that we can't continue to deliver tax cuts for all and increases in all sorts of payments, and at the same time continue to spend more in line with community expectations. Something has to give in the end.
Josh Frydenberg, your view on whether Martin Parkinson is right in this case, and there is a need for Australians to swallow much larger or significantly larger taxes or expect a lot less from our government?
We don't believe there's a revenue problem. Revenue's actually up $80 billion from the last year of the Howard government, but spending's up $120 billion. So what we've said is that Australians will need to tighten the belt, and particularly government will need to stop the wasteful spending that we've seen over the last 5 years. I mean, the Gillard and Rudd governments have introduced about 30 new taxes. Of course, the carbon tax and the mining tax are the most obvious, but there's been a whole lot of other taxes right down the line. These are disincentives to investment, the disincentives to people to re-enter the workforce. There's no doubt what Martin Parkinson was alluding to about, structural issues with the budget are real. Namely, health spending is up 74% in real terms over the last decade, Tim. So, we do need to look at these issues. They need brave governments. This government is not one of those. So we'll have to look at it. But if we can get the spending under control, we don't actually believe you need higher taxes. You just need more effective, revenue, more effective revenue streams in order to pay for your necessary spending. But spending as a proportion of GDP is certainly too high at the moment.
Tony Abbott says this morning that Australians shouldn't be afraid of taxation changes. I'd like to get your response, a brief response from both of you. First, Josh Frydenberg, is Tony Abbott right to say let's not blink or let's not balk at the possibility of significant tax change?
Well, if he's talking about cutting the carbon tax and cutting the mining tax, then they should certainly not balk at that because they're going to be important taxes to repeal.
How about the courage to look at the GST?
Well, what Tony has said is that we have no plans to increase the GST. Let's not verbal Tony Abbott here. He said we have no plans to increase the GST. What we will do, Tim, is we'll conduct a proper review. I mean, the Labor Party conducted the Henry Tax Review, came up with 138 recommendations, and they plucked one out, which was namely the mining tax, and they botched the implementation of that. We'll have a proper tax review. Now, if there are significant changes, then we will seek a mandate at the next election, not this one, at the following election, unlike the Labor Party who said we're not going to have a carbon tax before the election and subsequently introduced one. So we will take the lesson of John Howard, which was if you're going to introduce significant tax change, you take it to the people, you secure a mandate, you put your political life on the line. At the end of the day, he introduced a tax which has made Australia's economy stronger.
Joel Fitzgibbon, it's hard to be critical, isn't it, of a thorough taxation review in the first term of an Abbott government, and then the people able to decide whether we do go ahead with big reforms like changes to the GST and the like, isn't it?
But Tim, Josh just contradicted himself. He first of all said that Tony Abbott claims to have no plans to increase the GST. Then he says Tony Abbott has promised indeed not to increase the GST without going to an election beforehand. Now, I'll leave it to the Australian people to come to the conclusion about whether he can be trusted on that front. But let's go back to the carbon price. John Howard promised a carbon price. Malcolm Turnbull and Brendan Nelson both wanted a carbon price. Tony Abbott has the same commitment to greenhouse gas reduction as does the government, but he says he's going to spend billions of dollars directly subsidising businesses which are prepared to reduce their carbon footprint, and yet he's got all this compensation to pay to individuals and companies, which was put in place by this government. So, you know, Martin Parkinson talks about a structural budget problem. Tony Abbott has just made that problem far, far, far worse.
Joel Fitzgibbon, you know Kevin Rudd pretty well. What strikes you about his change to support same-sex marriage?
Well, it doesn't surprise me because Kevin, like all of us, or most of us, have been struggling with this issue for a number of years. We can all see both sides to the views of our local communities. Now, I don't know the view of Kevin's local community, but I know mine pretty well, and I think in my electorate, the overwhelming majority of people are against changes to the Marriage Act. Now, maybe it's a different story in Kevin's electorate, and maybe he's reflecting that point, but he's made the point that he's struggled with it for some time. He's thoroughly researched it, and he's come down with what I've no doubt is a difficult decision for a guy so deeply committed to his faith as is Kevin.
Now, plenty in the opposition have been quick to say, oh, this is attention-seeking behaviour for a Kevin Rudd who hasn't given up his hopes of returning to the leadership. Now, you would know that better than anybody else. Tell us what your thoughts are on that comment.
Well, you know, the opposition will always try to make a leadership story of it, Tim. I think it's a complete red herring. Again, it's an issue Kevin's been struggling, like all of us, for a long time, and he's come to a decision, and I congratulate him for his conviction and his courage to do so.
Josh Frydenberg, when you and your Liberal colleagues debate possible privatisation of the ABC and SBS at the weekend, what will you personally argue?
There's no, I mean, this is a real first. There's no plans whatsoever to privatise the ABC and the SBS, whether it's the Labor Party or the Liberal Party or any political party. The grassroots organisation have vibrant debates, and you encourage that. And people or branches can put up motions and have them discussed. But this is not policy. I think the ABC does a good job. You know, quite clearly, it's a national broadcaster, and you know, it does have coalition support. But you know what? I just want to tell you, Tim, what Joel nicely slipped out of that Kevin Rudd story. He forgot to tell you he's probably got the caucus list in his pocket, because it's very strange for Kevin to come out in the way that he has on this issue of gay marriage, and the timing of it, no doubt, is in some way connected to his own political future. And I think that there is still a chance. There is still a chance that the Labor Party, all those marginal seat holders who are looking at the polling numbers and thinking, I do not want to go to an election under Julia Gillard, they may just you know, tap him on the shoulder and say, please, please, Kevin, it's time to come back.
Joshua Frydenberg in Melbourne. In Sydney, Joel Fitzgibbon, great to have you on Wednesday Breaking Politics. Thanks again for your time.
It's a pleasure,
Thanks, Tim.